Section 26 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 26. Since it was a very hot night, and the paper boys went by with placards proclaiming in huge red letters that there was a heat wave, wicker chairs were placed on the hotel steps, and there, sipping, smoking, detached gentlemen sat. Peter Walsh sat there. One might fancy that day, the London day, was just beginning. Like a woman who had slipped off her print dress and white apron to array herself in blue and pearls, the day changed, put off stuff, took gauze, changed to an evening, and with the same sigh of exhilaration that a woman breathes, tumbling petticoats on the floor, it too shed dust, heat, colour. The traffic thinned. Motor cars, tinkling, darting, succeeded the lumber of vans, and here and there among the thick foliage of the squares an intense light hung. I resign, the evening seemed to say, as it paled and faded above the battlements and prominences, moulded, pointed, of hotel, flat, and block of shops. I fade, she was beginning, I disappear. But London would have none of it, and rushed her bayonets into the sky, pinioned her, constrained her to partnership in her revelry. For the great revolution of Mr. Willet's summer-time had taken place since Peter Walsh's last visit to England. The prolonged evening was new to him. It was inspiriting, rather. For as the young people went by with their dispatch boxes, awfully glad to be free, proud too, dumbly, of stepping this famous pavement, joy of a kind, cheap, tinselly, if you like, but all the same rapture flushed their faces. They dressed well too, pink stockings, pretty shoes. They would now have 2 hours at the pictures. It sharpened, it refined them, the yellow-blue evening light, and on the leaves in the square shone lurid, livid. They looked as if dipped in sea-water, the foliage of a submerged city. He was astonished by the beauty. It was encouraging too, for where the returned Anglo-Indians sat by rights, he knew crowds of them, in the Oriental Club, biliously summing up the ruin of the world, here was he, as young as ever, envying young people their summer-time and the rest of it, and more than suspecting, from the words of a girl, from a housemaid's laughter, intangible things you couldn't lay your hands on, that shift in the whole pyramidal accumulation which in his youth had seemed immovable. On top of them it had pressed, weighed them down, the women especially, like those flowers Clarissa's Aunt Helena used to press between sheets of grey blotting paper with Littre's dictionary on top, sitting under the lamp after dinner. She was dead now. He had heard of her, from Clarissa, losing the sight of one eye. It seemed so fitting, one of nature's masterpieces, that old Miss Parry should turn to glass. She would die like some bird in a frost gripping her perch. She belonged to a different age, but being so entire, so complete, would always stand up on the horizon, stone-white, eminent, like a lighthouse marking some past stage on this adventurous, long, long voyage, this interminable— He felt for a copper to buy a paper, and read about Surrey and Yorkshire. He had held out that copper millions of times. Surrey was all out once more. This interminable life. But cricket was no mere game. Cricket was important. He could never help reading about cricket. He read the scores in the stop-press first, then how it was a hot day, then about a murder case. Having done things millions of times enriched them, though it might be said to take the surface off. The past enriched, and experience, and having cared for one or two people, and so having acquired the power which the young lack, of cutting short, doing what one likes, not caring a rap what people say, and coming and going without any very great expectations. He left his paper on the table and moved off. Which, however, and he looked for his hat and coat, was not altogether true of him, not tonight, for here he was starting to go to a party, at his age, with the belief upon him that he was about to have an experience. But what? Beauty, anyhow. Not the crude beauty of the eye. It was not beauty pure and simple, Bedford Place leading into Russell Square. It was straightness and emptiness, of course, the symmetry of a corridor. But it was also windows lit up, a piano, a gramophone sounding, a sense of pleasure-making hidden, but now and again emerging when, through the uncurtained window, the window left open, one saw parties sitting over tables, young people slowly circling, conversations between men and women, maids idly looking out, a strange comment theirs when work was done. Stockings drying on top ledges, a parrot, a few plants. Absorbing, mysterious, of infinite richness, this life. And in the large square where the cabs shot and swerved so quick, there were loitering couples, dallying, embracing, shrunk up under the shower of a tree. That was moving. So silent, so absorbed, that one passed discreetly, timidly, as if in the presence of some sacred ceremony to interrupt which would have been impious. That was interesting. And so on into the flare and glare. His light overcoat blew open. He stepped with indescribable idiosyncrasy, leant a little forward, tripped, with his hands behind his back, and his eyes still a little hawk-like. He tripped through London, towards Westminster, observing. Was everybody dining out, then? Doors were being opened here by a footman to let issue a high-stepping old dame in buckled shoes, with 3 purple ostrich feathers in her hair. Doors were being opened for ladies wrapped like mummies in shawls with bright flowers on them, ladies with bare heads. And in respectable quarters, with stucco pillars through small front gardens lightly swathed with combs in their hair, having run up to see the children, women came, men waited for them, with their coats blowing open, and the motor started. Everybody was going out. What with these doors being opened, and the descent and the start, it seemed as if the whole of London were embarking in little boats moored to the bank, tossing on the waters as if the whole place were floating off in carnival. And Whitehall was skated over, silver-beaten as it was, skated over by spiders, and there was a sense of midges round the arc lamps. It was so hot that people stood about talking. And here in Westminster was a retired judge, presumably, sitting foursquare at his house door dressed all in white, an Anglo-Indian presumably. And here a shindy of brawling women, drunken women, here only a policeman and looming houses, high houses, domed houses, churches, parliaments, and the hoot of a steamer on the river, a hollow misty cry. But it was her street, this, Clarissa's. Cabs were rushing round the corner, like water round the piers of a bridge, drawn together, it seemed to him, because they bore people going to her party, Clarissa's party. The cold stream of visual impressions failed him now, as if the eye were a cup that overflowed and let the rest run down its china walls unrecorded. The brain must wake now. The body must contract now, entering the house, the lighted house, where the door stood open, where the motor cars were standing, and bright women descending. The soul must brave itself to endure. He opened the big blade of his pocket-knife. Lucy came running full tilt downstairs, having just nipped into the drawing-room to smooth a cover, to straighten a chair, to pause a moment and feel whoever came in must think how clean, how bright, how beautifully cared for when they saw the beautiful silver, the brass fire-irons, the new chair-covers and the curtains of yellow chintz. She appraised each, heard a roar of voices, people already coming up from dinner. She must fly. The Prime Minister was coming, Agnes said. So she had heard them say in the dining-room, she said, coming in with a tray of glasses. Did it matter? Did it matter in the least? One Prime Minister more or less? It made no difference at this hour of the night, to Mrs. Walker among the plates, saucepans, colanders, frying-pans, chicken in aspic, ice-cream freezers, pared crusts of bread, lemons, soup tureens, and pudding basins, which, however hard they washed up in the scullery, seemed to be all on top of her, on the kitchen table, on chairs, while the fire blared and roared, the electric lights glared, and still supper had to be laid. All she felt was, one Prime Minister more or less made not a scrap of difference to Mrs. Walker. The ladies were going upstairs already, said Lucy. The ladies were going up, one by one, Mrs. Dalloway walking last, and almost always sending back some message to the kitchen. My love to Mrs. Walker, that was it one night. Next morning they would go over the dishes, the soup, the salmon, Mrs. Walker knew, as usual, underdone, for she always got nervous about the pudding and left it to Jenny. So it happened, the salmon was always underdone. But some lady with fair hair and silver ornaments had said, Lucy said, about the entree, was it really made at home? But it was the salmon that bothered Mrs. Walker, as she spun the plates round and pulled in dampers and pulled out dampers, and there came a burst of laughter from the dining-room, a voice speaking, then another burst of laughter, the gentlemen enjoying themselves when the ladies had gone. The Tokay, said Lucy, running in. Mr. Dalloway had sent for the Tokay from the Emperor's cellars, the Imperial Tokay. It was borne through the kitchen. Over her shoulder, Lucy reported how Miss Elizabeth looked quite lovely. She couldn't take her eyes off her, in her pink dress, wearing the necklace Mr. Dalloway had given her. Jenny must remember the dog, Miss Elizabeth's fox terrier, which, since it bit, had to be shut up and might, Elizabeth thought, want something. Jenny must remember the dog. But Jenny was not going upstairs with all those people about. There was a motor at the door already, there was a ring at the bell, and the gentleman still in the dining-room drinking Tokay. There, they were going upstairs, that was the first to come, and now they would come faster and faster, so that Mrs. Parkinson, hired for parties, would leave the hall door ajar, and the hall would be full of gentlemen waiting. They stood waiting, sleeking down their hair, while the ladies took their cloaks off in the room along the passage, where Mrs. Barnett helped them, old Ellen Barnett, who had been with the family 40 years, and came every summer to help the ladies, and remembered mothers when they were girls, and though very unassuming did shake hands, said "Milady" very respectfully, yet had a humorous way with her, looking at the young ladies, and ever so tactfully helping Lady Lovejoy, who had some trouble with her underbodice. And they could not help feeling, Lady Lovejoy and Miss Alice, that some little privilege in the matter of brush and comb was awarded them, having known Mrs. Barnett. 30 years, milady, Mrs. Barnett supplied her. Young ladies did not use to rouge, said Lady Lovejoy, when they stayed at Burton in the old days. And Miss Alice didn't need rouge, said Mrs. Barnett, looking at her fondly. There Mrs. Barnett would sit in the cloakroom, patting down the furs, smoothing out the Spanish shawls, tidying the dressing-table, and knowing perfectly well, in spite of the furs and embroideries, which were nice ladies, which were not. The dear old body, said Lady Lovejoy, mounting the stairs, Clarissa's old nurse. And then Lady Lovejoy stiffened. Lady and Miss Lovejoy, she said to Mr. Wilkins, hired for parties. He had an admirable manner as he bent and straightened himself, and announced with perfect impartiality, Lady and Miss Lovejoy, Sir John and Lady Needham, Miss Weld, Mr. Walsh. His manner was admirable. His family life must be irreproachable, except that it seemed impossible that a being with greenish lips and shaven cheeks could ever have blundered into the nuisance of children. "How delightful to see you," said Clarissa. She said it to everyone. "How delightful to see you." She was at her worst, effusive, insincere. It was a great mistake to have come. He should have stayed at home and read his book, thought Peter Walsh. Should have gone to a music hall. He should have stayed at home, for he knew no one. Oh dear, it was going to be a failure, a complete failure. Clarissa felt it in her bones as dear old Lord Lexham stood there apologising for his wife who had caught cold at the Buckingham Palace garden party. She could see Peter out of the tail of her eye, criticising her, there in that corner. Why, after all, did she do these things? Why seek pinnacles and stand drenched in fire? Might it consume her anyhow, burn her to cinders? Better anything. Better brandish one's torch and hurl it to earth than taper and dwindle away like some Ellie Henderson. It was extraordinary how Peter put her into these states just by coming and standing in a corner. He made her see herself, exaggerate. It was idiotic. But why did he come, then, merely to criticise? Why always take, never give? Why not risk one's one little point of view? There he was, wandering off, and she must speak to him. But she would not get the chance. Life was that. Humiliation. Renunciation. What Lord Lexham was saying was that his wife would not wear her furs at the garden party because, "My dear, you ladies are all alike." Lady Lexham being 75 at least. It was delicious how they petted each other, that old couple. She did like old Lord Lexham. She did think it mattered, her party. And it made her feel quite sick to know that it was all going wrong, all falling flat. Anything, any explosion, any horror was better than people wandering aimlessly, standing in a bunch at a corner like Ellie Henderson, not even caring to hold themselves upright. End of section 26, read by Hannah Dormer, London, 24th of October 2021.